All right, so we want to talk real quickly on general rules of interpretation. We're making good time because we want to at least leave a half hour to answer other additional questions for today. But the general rules of interpretation are the set of hierarchical rules that we as customs brokers and you as importers need to make sure you follow and or document that you follow these when trying to classify a product. I know that you see on our newsletter about general rate increases, which is also a GRI. It's a bad GRI, by the way. But general rules of interpretation, these are good general rules. And again, it follows a hierarchical order, meaning that we look at general rule of interpretation 1 first. If we can't determine the tariff classification utilizing this rule, then we go on to the second rule and then the third rule, and so forth until we can ultimately determine what the tariff classification of the product is. Now, Allison had mentioned all kinds of tools that are available for us to utilize, but the first thing we want to start with is what tariff number do we think it's at? And then we try to find validating rulings, case law, things like that to help support that end rule, and we utilize the general rule. So I'm going to go through today really the first 3, which are really important, and the ones that if you can't find it using the first 3, then there's some additional rules, but we spend most of our time on the first 3. And in rule number 1, we talk about the classification shall be determined according to the headings, sections, and chapter notes. And we identified the tariff earlier that had chapters, headings, subheadings, and then the tariff item as well. But so this rule says you need to look at the chapter notes, you need to look at the section notes in order to determine what the tariff classification is, because certain notes might exclude certain specific items and or other things. So we included an example here, and again, that you compare heading to heading. We kind of talked about that at the beginning. That first 4 digits is the heading. If we're looking at an item, we want to compare 2 things. And I use the example of an electronic toothbrush. So an electronic toothbrush, heading 8509 is for electromechanical domestic appliances. Heading 9603 is for brushes, brooms, and so forth. Okay, so when we're comparing heading to heading, which one seems to be more correct? But if I look at 9603.21, I see that is a subheading and it says toothbrushes. Okay, so if I compare the one that says toothbrushes at a subheading to the heading 8509, I'm not comparing on the same level. And therefore, I would end up classifying this product wrong, because 95 or 8509 is actually the correct classification for electric toothbrushes, where 9603.21 is for the manual toothbrush that you would utilize. So again, we have to compare heading to heading to find the right area first. We can't compare subheading to heading, and that's why I give that example. And then it says in the rules, and it says it at the bottom of each rule, if you cannot determine the classification using rule 1, we have to move on to rules number 2.
Step 2.
But here's one more example, chapter of an item here. Baby safety spoons, you know, the little metal spoon that has a nice little tip if you've had children or ever fed a child, and it's got a little plastic thing on there. If you look at specific notes, and again, we have to look at notes, chapter 82 is where I would normally classify a spoon because it's in the tariff by name in chapter 82. But note 1 to chapter 82 says that this chapter only covers articles with a working edge or working surface of metal. Well, the plastic coating on that is really what you're using to feed the baby. And therefore, based on this one note, you cannot classify that baby spoon in chapter 82. All right, it has to be moved to chapter 7323, which is articles of metal and stainless steel. Okay, so that's an important example, and the duty rate will be different based on that too. Okay, so again, it can be very complicated and very confusing, and that's why we would also look at rulings to help support some of those initiatives as well. All right. General Rule 2 says that any reference to a heading or an article shall include reference to that item unfinished. I consider this, and then headings including mixtures, combinations, and so forth, are part of that. And if we can't utilize this rule 2, then we would utilize general rule 3. But general rule 2 is really the bicycle rule. And if you want to flip this over, the bicycle rule is that when you ship a bicycle, it typically ships unassembled. so that you can maximize the space and things like that. Well, when you open the box, it still looks like a bicycle, so you're going to classify it as a bicycle. You're not going to open the box and classify it as rubber tires and spokes and those and seats and handlebars and those kinds of things. You're going to classify it as a bicycle because it is complete. Now, it might be missing the tires, and it can miss certain pieces and still be classified as a bicycle, but that's kind of what that general rule 2 says, is that it includes that item as though it was unassembled as well. And then we would just look at that essential character, and you're going to hear essential character a couple more times in order to determine the final classification of the item. Essential character is really an analysis that you hear Allison say often. I know I say it often. I send it in emails to folks all the time, is what is the essential character of this item, especially if the item is a mixture of 2 goods and or 2 chemicals, those kinds of things. I ask that question. And the definition or some factors that we put to create a definition of that is the nature of the material or component. Is it metal? Is it plastic? The quantity or weight by value, role of the constituent materials as it relates to the use of the good, and attributes which strongly marks or serves as the distinguishing factor of the item, and or its core use and conditions. So anyways, essential character is, and again, the problem with essential character is it is subject to our interpretation. Mm-hmm. And our interpretation is often determined by our backgrounds. Allison was from Eastern Iowa. Was from the Kansas City area my whole life. We've probably experienced different things which would make us look at a product a little bit differently. And so anyways, we've got to think about that when we use essential character, and that's why we utilize case law and so many other things to help us validate our own opinions. General Rule 3, it's one of my favorite rules because in General Rule 3, it says that if by application of General Rule 2, you have 2 goods that are prima facie, meaning on the face of the item, classified in 2 or more headings, classification will determine by this. The heading that provides the most specific description. Remember how we talked about primary use, we talked about EO nominee, basket provisions, parts provisions, based on the one that's most specific, unless it refers only to the substance of the part. Mixture or composite of the goods set up for retail sale, which cannot be classified according to the heading with the most specific direction, is consisting of the material or substance which gives them the essential character. Again, they use essential character. So what that's saying is that if we have 2 items and we can't tell, we have to ask the question, which one is the essential character? And then we'll classify it according to the essential character. In a sense, we're going back to one of the other general rules of interpretation to determine. And then the last one says that if that doesn't work and we still don't know the classification, there is no essential character of the item, which again is based on our opinion sometimes, then we have to class it based on the one that's last in the harmonized tariff system. And this is a rule that is often utilized in apparel. So say you have 50% cotton and 50% polyester, you're going to utilize, unless the essential character of one of the items stands out, you're going to utilize the tariff number that's last in the tariff, okay? If you cannot determine an essential character of the item. So that one's often used in clothing, that we use the one that's last in the tariff. And again, what are we looking at? Rule of relative specificity. What is the most specific rule? The heading requires more difficult to satisfy is typically the rule that we would use, because if it meets all of these specific things, then that's probably the provision that we need to utilize versus say a basket provision, and I've got them listed there on the slide. You know, actual use, principal use, EO nominee, parts provisions, basket provisions. And again, you're saying, why is EO nominee not the same? Because we used that in the toothbrush example. Toothbrush was not the right place to put the electromechanical appliance. So anyways, let's look at those. And here's some examples of some headings. 9025, which is a more specific heading than say 9033, which is parts and accessories thereof. Okay, that would be more of a basket category. And go on more. If we've got a kit, that's consistent of, and kits are kind of in their own world. In a kit, let's use the example of a roadside kit.
Yeah.
Right? In a roadside kit, you might have some flares, you might have some triangles, some reflective triangles, you might have a blanket, a flashlight, a screwdriver, something like that that says, hey, if I'm in trouble, these are the 5 or 6 ingredients that I will need in a roadside kit. If it all serves that function of meeting that roadside kit, then it can be classified as a kit. But say you take that one example and then you throw on some crayons and a coloring book.
I know that might be necessary.
Right, if you have kids, right. But that kit, an example, by just throwing in 2 items that aren't relevant to fixing the car and or the hazard of the road, could make you then, that's not, and by customs probably would not be considered a kit, because the coloring book and the crayons don't really have anything to do with specifically helping you in a hazard on the road. And therefore you would have to break it out and classify it completely separately. So we have to look at kits very, very specific to their use and make sure that all the items in a kit, and many of you that are on this call, I know I've worked with you in the past on kits, and we always ask those questions. Sometimes we laugh and sometimes we say, well, let's remove this one item, and then we know that we can classify it as a kit moving forward. And again, we have to remember not to forget inside of kits, country of origin markings. And we have some great techniques here as a customs broker to break out things based on tariff numbers, but still classify it as a kit. We call it XTVs, things like that. So, and my favorite, and I include this example all the time when I'm talking about General Rule of Interpretation 3, is a fishing rod and fishing reel put up for retail sale. And again, when we're talking about interpretation and what we feel like, I would ask you, Allison, which is the essential character, the rod or the reel, in your opinion?
Good question.
I mean, do you have one?
Maybe.
Because to me, it was the rod.
I was going to say the rod.
I was going to say the rod. I mean, and honestly, I did say the rod. This is a question that I actually missed on the customs broker's license exam. Because to me, I can still catch a fish with a rod, and I don't need the reel. But in customs evaluation of the rod and the reel, they've determined that there is no essential character between the rod and the reel, and therefore it should be classified based on which one is last in the harmonized tariff system. So this was one that, as I was leaving the test in St. Louis, I called someone in my office and said, can you look this up for me and see if there's an essential character here? And they did, and they found several rulings on it, and it determined that the reel. So driving the 3 hours from St. Louis to Kansas City, I knew that I missed one on the classification of rods and reels. So I've included this ever since on every presentation I've done as it relates to classification. So those are the main 3 that we wanted to cover. We can look at these 4, 5, and 6. 4 is really, we use the word akin with 4, and believe it or not, in rulings I've utilized that word akin. And the reason 4 is becoming a little more popular is that with the speed of technology today, and the lack of speed with updating the harmonized tariff system, we find that technology is blending technologies of multiple machines and manufacturing and robotics, and creating items that are really, really tough to classify. And we really have to look at something and say, well, that's really kind of like this. It's really akin to this. And that's where we would look at General Rule 4. But that's only if we can determine it based on the other 3 provisions prior to General 4. But certainly if the harmonized tariff system could keep up with technology, we again might be able to find these a little bit quicker, or might be able to see some of these a little bit differently. General 5 is for cases. So if you import a guitar and it comes in a case, the case is classified with the guitar. And then 6 is, again, breaking down subheadings, chapter notes, subnotes of things that are there. And the last thing is the additional rules for the United States. And these rules are very specific to use provisions. Okay, meaning that they have to qualify and use the term as a snapshot at the time of importation. What is the actual use at the time of importation? If you take that snapshot and it's intended for this use, and you can validate that use within 3 years of the item and so forth, then that is the actual use of the item. And then it talks about parts and parts provisions, because some tariff numbers will say in parts thereof, like we mentioned earlier. Some won't have a parts provision. And if it doesn't have a parts provision, you can't make one up. Okay, it is not the item. We have to look at the notes and the chapter notes, and maybe we have to classify that as a specific item. And the last item is D, and that comes down to that rule XI, which is in mixtures such as for clothing. And that's 50-50 cotton, 50 polyester. We utilize those same rules, and or we classify it using the last one in the tariff.